very much for inviting me to come here and speak about the situation in Sweden. And many people we've been following radioactive waste management for a long time, have understood that, first of all, Sweden has worked a long time with a concept that has been seen as being successful for a long time. But in the last few years, during the review of the application for a repository for spent fuel, things are happening which were not foreseen, and things are taking very much more time. And this is what you have called the blockage, I guess in French. But you can go back to the first slide, please. I just want to say something about myself. My name is Johan Swahn, and I work for an organization called MKG. And I work for the largest Swedish environmental organization, Naturskyddsföreningen, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, and also for the Friends of the Earth in Sweden. And I've been working now for 15 years on these issues in MKG, only on nuclear waste. I've been following this very carefully. I've been involved in the whole process for the whole process, basically. I have an engineering background, engineering physics, so I also have the possibility to follow the technical details down to the minutiae, the tiny technical details. And we will talk about corrosion issues, which is also, of course, a very technical issue. I also work for Nuclear Transparency Watch. It's an organization on European level, working on transparency on nuclear issues, on nuclear safety, and it's something that I think that if you are working for some members of Parliament here, European Parliament, we would also, from Nuclear Transparency Watch, be interested in having contact with you. And we've had contact with Michelle and Rebecca and others through the past. So now I will, next slide please. So I will talk a bit about the Swedish industry's plans for a repository for spent fuel. It's in Sweden the industry that has responsibility for the fuel, not like in France where it's the government. And there is an ongoing license process for a repository for spent fuel, and it's now on the governmental level. And the problem of the long-term integrity of the copper canister, that is isolates the waste from the environment, is what is basically being the only discussed issue remaining, even though I think there are many other issues that could be discussed regarding the safety and the reliability of the repository. So there was a decision by the Environmental Court and a regulator on January 23rd, 2018, with recommendations to the government. And I'll come back to that, because as I said, that's important, because both the regulator and the court had different opinions about the safety. And the court said that the copper corrosion issue may be so important that the government should take it seriously and do its own investigations. So there is an ongoing government review, and I will also talk some about possible future developments. Next slide, please. This is the KBS method, developed in the 70s, late 70s, and the idea is to use the granite rock. We only basically have granite in Sweden for the bedrock. You go down to 500 meters, you have tunnels, you drill holes in the tunnel floors, you put the spent fuel in copper canisters, and you have clay around it. And the clay is supposed to protect the copper canister. Now, these barriers of clay and copper, they are supposed to isolate the waste for basically 1 million years, at least hundreds of thousands of years. And there is always flowing groundwater in granite. So it is a challenge, especially when we have ice ages and so on coming, well, perhaps not now with global warming, but who knows? The concept was developed at a time when they had to make it safe, even though there's an ice age or two that takes place. Next slide, please. The site chosen is in Forsmark, and it's north of Stockholm. There has been a long process of finding that site. It can be described in a speech of its own. But in 2009, the industry itself chose Forsmark. And next slide, please. 2 years later, it's basically 9 years ago soon, the industry made an application for a repository. And the application goes both to the regulator, the Radiation Safety Authority, and the Environmental Court, because in Sweden we have two legislations governing nuclear issues. The Environmental Act, which covers all environmental problems, and the Nuclear Act, especially for nuclear issues. Now, the whole review on completeness and on issues took until the summer of 2017. An enormous amount of issues were covered. MKG and the organizations that I work for, we were involved with long briefs, and also, of course, other parts of society were involved, the communities that have the waste, and basically the whole, anybody interested in Sweden, of course, can be involved in this, because this is what the Environmental Act allows, participation. But during the review process, the problems of copper canister were raised by some actors, including researchers at the Royal Institute of Technology. Next slide, please. Now, this is basically just to show, this is a licensed application. It came in these boxes, and on top of that shelf there, which is in my office, is sort of the extra information that was given by the industry. Below there, actually you can't see it all down there, but are all the reports supporting the application. So it's a huge thing to review, of course, this kind of process. Next slide, please. These are briefs done by my organizations, done between 2012 and 2017. Next slide, please. So in the autumn of 2017, a very important happening took place, because the main meeting of the Environmental Court took place. It was actually for a long time. We spent 5 weeks during 8 weeks. In Stockholm, 3 weeks, 1 week in Forsmark, in the Östhammars community in Forsmark, and one in Oskarshamns community, where they have they're going to have the encapsulation plant, because that's where we have the interim storage site club. At the meeting, the regulator told the court that the copper corrosion issue could be dealt with later. And this is because they have a different legislation. They have a legislation where they can continue to do reviews for a long time, while the court only has one chance. But what is important here is that the court then questioned this, and the court basically said that, well, we have the same, you have in your legislation the same criteria as we have in the Environmental Act, and therefore you should be following the same criteria. And this means it has to be shown that it's safe at this time, now in the court. And in the court proceedings, you also had these quite eminent scientists, corrosion scientists from the Royal Institute of Technology, and they were strongly questioning SKB's, the company's position on. So we had a big debate going on in the court. We spent, the court added extra days to discuss corrosion. Also, during the proceedings, there was some leakage of information from the regulator into the media. First of all, it showed that the corrosion expert of the regulator was against going ahead. So the corrosion expert for the regulator, he later left the regulator. He was against saying yes. Also, there were leakage of scenarios showing that the regulator knew that there were scenarios of copper corrosion and other integrity problems with the canister that would give rise to radiation levels that would be above the limit, the criteria of the regulator. Next slide, please. Here is how it looked. They had to rent a conference place for this. And this is our team there in the picture. Next picture, please. Well, this actually is part of the documentation coming out, leaking out of the regulator. This is an article of this. Next slide, please. So I come back to the January 23rd of 2018, when the court made its recommendation to the government to say no to the application, primarily because of the uncertainties regarding the long-term safety of the planned repository due to the possible copper canister problems. And they said that these issues have to be solved before the government makes a decision. On the same date, the regulator told the government that everything should be okay, and possible problems with the copper corrosion can be dealt with at a later date. So they said that the government should say yes. Now, the court decision took many people in Sweden by surprise. Not all, because if you spoke to good environmental lawyers, they would see that having a big discussion about a very important issue at the main meeting of the court would be taken very seriously by the court, and the court would then likely make this recommendation. But it was taken by surprise, and I think it's actually quite an interesting process, showing how this system built up for Swedish participatory decision-making, it's spelled wrong there, has worked to some extent, because if there has been a problem, it can still be discussed. Now, what is the problem with copper? Very shortly, this is extremely complicated. The idea of using copper is that when you put copper underground, there is no oxygen in the ground, underground. It's consumed very fast after you close the repository. So it's not like when you have copper on your roofs, where, of course, it becomes green and black, and it takes, it takes a long time for it to break down, but it's not a question of a million years up here in the atmosphere. But down there, it was supposed to be like gold. Actually, the industry used that comparison, that copper is like gold when you put it underneath the ground. The problem appears to be that the copper reacts with water, and not only with oxygen. And of course, water contains oxygen and hydrogen, and you have hydrogen that comes out, similar problems that you have with steel corrosion. This is still not clearly understood what the process is, even though there have been, certainly there have been advances, theoretical advances to understand this process. It's clear that if you have a very smooth copper surface, it takes more time. So the normal copper surface can corrode. This has also been a problem with trying to repeat experiments. And if you actually put copper, which is very smooth, you cannot repeat an experiment showing that there's a problem. But it does lead to a situation where it may take much shorter time for a canister to break down. We're talking about 5 centimeters of copper. And if it breaks before 1,000 years has gone, 1,000 years is a long time, but there is a lot of activity in spent fuel. So there will be consequences for the surface at this time. Exactly how high, it's difficult to know. It depends on the other barriers. The pictures on the left are quite interesting because they are from an 18-year-old study, a Swiss experiment called FEBEX. And they put in some copper pieces in this experiment. It's basically an experiment with steel and clay in Switzerland. And the corrosion is quite high. Actually, it's very high if the system has been without oxygen since the beginning. And we can see from a new experiment called FE that oxygen is consumed only within a couple of months in a big tunnel like this. So we think it's clear that this has been the situation. It's an anoxic environment, like the one but it's been there for 18 years, and you have deep pits in the copper. So this is why, from my point of view, it is quite a serious experiment showing that there is a big problem. One can discuss lots of experiments have been done in the laboratory and so on with different qualities, but this is actually a very clear indication that there is a problem where you have a real situation underground in a repository situation. Next, please. Now, I'm soon finishing up. The government review is ongoing. Now, the nuclear industry submitted a complementary information on April 4th last year, 2019. And comments have come in from all actors provided to the government in the autumn of 2019. Actually, the regulator says that its conviction is that the repository is safe, is strengthened by the new SKB information in the complementary information. However, the Swedish Council for Nuclear Waste says there may be problems with the copper. And this is the advisory board to the government, the scientific advisory board to the government, which is important because it means that there is an additional actor which has doubts about the copper. We have made, from our point of view, strong statements saying that copper should not be used as a canister material. Large amount understanding the experiment, the results from the FEBEX experiment. And also the researchers at the KTH, at the University in Stockholm, they persevere. And now you remember that I told you that the expert of the copper corrosion expert at the regulator did not agree. He's now working outside the regulator together with these researchers, writing reviews to the government at this time. There's uncertainty whether there will be a new round of commenting. It's possible. Now, this is new. What happened this autumn is that there is actually a Swedish experiment called LOT, the LOT experiment we call it. It's copper and clay. I will actually, next slide please for a short while. One more. No. Yeah, there it is. It's copper and clay, and it's a miniature sort of canister with clay around it. And this was taken down into the ground around 2000. It's about 20 years old, this experiment. And there were 6 of these packages. One of them was taken out after 5 years in 2006. And from following the whole thing from that time, it's quite clear that the industry realized that there could have been something wrong, because I think they saw much more corrosion than they had expected. And they tried to say that this is because oxygen closed into the system. Now, we have been demanding to take out a new package for a long, long time, because we think that the next package should have been taken out after 10 years, and we could have compared it to the 5-year package. Now it's 20 years. Now, this autumn, quite by chance actually, I was at a meeting. We were discussing research at the regulator, because there's a research plan at the moment that's being discussed from the industry. And I asked the SKB representative when they were going to take out the next loot package. And she answered they have already taken them out, which was very, very, for everybody in the room, strange, because they had not said nothing about this. And there was nothing in the research plan, nothing like this. And I think it might be that she made a mistake in saying this, possibly. But because we have now, there are 2 packages available now for review that can be compared to the FEBEX experiment, the one in the Swiss one. We are pretty sure that it can be shown by examining those packages whether copper is a good material or not. And we want the government and the regulator is hesitant. We want the government to make demands that the corrosion results from this experiment become part of the review process. And we are working on this at this time. So we can back up again. Yes, no, now we're back here. Next slide again then, please. And again. So the government has to take a decision on the permissibility according to the Environmental Act at some time. Maybe this year, maybe next year. And it can do 3 things. It can say yes, it can say no, but it can also take the case back down to the court. Because the court has the resources and the judicial right to make demands of this kind. Please, SKB, you have to show us these results, for example, from the experiment. And the government has more problems with doing that formally. It does not have the competence to do this, basically. So we do not know exactly what is happening, and also the community of Östhammar will have the chance to veto any decision by the government, and they will be asked. There might be a referendum also in Östhammar. So there are still many uncertainties. And I think that's the... Next slide. This is our environmental minister. I think she has been here. She's been in the parliament. Isabella Lövin, if you remember her. She was doing a lot of fishery, if some of you may remember her. She's now the Minister of Environment, and she has the responsibility. But of course, the government is also Social Democrats, and they have a coalition outside the government on budget issues with the Centre Party and Liberal Party. So it's a difficult decision. And I'm sure that they do not want to make this into a political decision. They want to make it a decision based on science. Also, after this decision has been taken, there are more decisions and more decisions. It may take 3 or 4 years in the different parts of the decision-making process before there is actually a construction start, if everything is okay with the copper and they go ahead. So that is my presentation. Thank you.